Hey guys, Brent Build Show. Today we're going to be talking about good moldings versus bad moldings. How do you know the difference? There's actually a classical overframe, which is a continuation of what we've been talking about, the classical system. There's also an historical basis. And so we're going to dive into those two methods of evaluating whether a molding is good or whether a molding is bad. Come join me. Okay, so first we're going to dig into the classical system, the classical framework for how to determine whether molding is good or bad. Now, one of the concepts of the classical system is that it's a language, okay? And as a language, that means it is communicating. There's a narrative, there's a story here, okay? That helps us read it, okay? Now, imagine if you're trying to read a book and every word is, there's no space between the words, there's no punctuation, it's just words on a page. Now, it would be very difficult to understand the meaning, right, the story there, because you can't read it, okay? The same thing is happening with bad moldings today, okay? Where you have a bunch of different bumps and bruises on this deal and that don't communicate. There's no relationship between them. There's no hierarchy. It's very difficult to read. Now, maybe in my hand when I'm showing you the edge you can see it, but imagine it up on a wall, right? Imagine it as a door casing or a window casing. All it's functioning to doing is painting a stripe with some lines on it. It doesn't communicate. Now, a good set of moldings communicates. It's easy to read, right? You can read that there is just this simple flat surface. It's punctuated with this outside, this tinea, the back band of the architrave. This pulvination and the frieze has just a slight curve to it. Bed mold, corona, cimation, right? All three of those things are easy to read. Now, part of having a good molding versus a bad molding is a language, or the ABCs. So we've got the ABCs, right? Here is your palette. Here's your ABCs. Here's your learning kit for how to communicate, right? Realize that it's fairly simple, okay? Realize that you've got plane surfaces, concave, convex, and compound, right? The cyma recta and cyma reversa obviously being the two most common ones we use in crowns, right? But you've also got this fillet and fascia. And one of the things that I was talking about is that flat plane surface, that this pause, okay, and this pause, the corona, this flat pause between them helps us to read it, okay? Helps us to understand the difference between the bed mold and the cimation, right? So when we're putting together moldings, when we're building moldings in a house, we want to have moldings that communicate well. So how do you pick moldings that communicate well, right? You go to a lumber yard, and I went to a big box store, I went to Home Depot, Lowe's, that kind of store, and I went to my local pro lumber yard, right? And I picked out moldings, you know, a whole stack of different moldings and details. Some are good, maybe 20%, and some are bad, okay? So how do you choose? You know, how do you know what this molding is, right? How do you know what the deal? Well, part of this, now we've studied the classical system and the language and understanding and simple details and simple elements. Now let's look at the historical aspect of this and how to put it together historically. All right, so there's an historical piece here, right? Talked about the classical. There's an historical piece that you need to understand in order to pick proper moldings, okay? Let's pretend, okay, well, here we are, America, right? So we're going to talk about American moldings. Now, our time frame starts, you know, if this is today, you know, and this is the start. Let's say this is Columbus. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, right? So that's 1492. We don't really have Jamestown 1600s, Colonial Williamsburg 1700s. So here's the deal. Let's just start like 1700, okay? The Georgian period really starts around 1740 and goes to 1780. This is Georgian, okay? We'll talk about this more in coming videos. King George, right? That's where the name comes from. This is period of time. It stops in 1780 because that's after the American Revolution, and the next period is federal, okay? And the federal period lasts until 1820, okay? After the federal period is the Greek Revival, okay? Revival lasts into the 1850s, 1860s, okay? And then we have the Victorian, okay? Now Victorian is all kinds of different styles. It's Second Empire, it's Queen Anne, it's Italianate, it's all those different crazy styles that are part of that Victorian era. And let's just say it ends in around 1900. Between 1900 and 1920 you have the arts and crafts, okay? And then in 1940 you have well, between here and then you have the period revival. Okay, that's the Tudor revivals, the Mission revivals, all those different revival styles, right? And then you have the World War II, and then you have the Ranch era, okay? Then you have McMansions, right? And here we are today. Now, I've told you that the classical period kind of falls apart in America around this era, right? So there's a number of key timelines in this era here, okay? If this is our timeline, World War II is an important timeline, okay? That's right here, World War II. The Civil War, right in here, 1863. That's a very important time, okay? Now, if we start breaking this up, especially right here around the Civil War, you have a pre-industrial, okay? Pre-industrial, and you have a post-industrial, okay? Now what does that mean? Well, pre-industrial will be handmade, okay? Post-industrial will be machine-made. So what happens here, remember James Watt, the steam engine, we start beginning to see steam manufacturing happening in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, right? I've got a flyer in there for an 1840s steam planing mill, talking about how much more cost-effective it is than hand plane, right? So this period, and after the Civil War, most millwork shops have all the tools that we have in them today, okay? So what happens is everything here is pre-industrial, everything here is post-industrial. What that means is that standardization, okay, starts here, okay? Standardized moldings, okay, that we see all across the country. Back here you have regional influences and regional differences. Okay, and things that were very popular in Philadelphia may not be as popular in Boston, right? So you would have these regional differences in the country with how things are being built. So there is historical differences between these different periods, right? This is a federal molding, right? This goes in this period of time, right? How do we know that? It came out of a home that was built during the federal era, and it has the hallmarks and traits of a federal molding, okay? Now, this is a Victorian molding. It's a plinth block. This comes from the Victorian era, right? This is a Victorian casing, Victorian molding. Now, some of the differences that you'll see about these moldings is that as standardization takes place post-industrial, okay, is that one, during this Victorian period, this is when you begin to see stained grade moldings. Before this time, most moldings in a house were almost 100%, almost 100% paint grade. Why? Because it's very difficult to hand plane oak, right? It's very difficult to do paneled wall and a panel detail in a very hard wood. So almost all of it was made with pine or cypress or some softer wood. During the Victorian era, that's when you see this explosion of wooden buildings with oak and maple and mahogany and all these different hardwoods, because we have machines that allow us to do that, all the way up until 1940. Now, I've talked about 1940 before. If you want to watch my video on William Levitt and how he changes buildings, okay, you'll see that, because this is another key detail. Because after 1940, that's when you begin to have not hollow core doors, right? You don't really have hollow core doors before then. As the world really rebuilds after this era, things become more focused on speed and production, less on craft, less on how things are made. So moldings begin to shrink. Now, this is from a 1927, 1928 catalog where it shows these moldings laid out, okay? It shows a crown molding, the 8013 versus the 7016, and how they've changed it to become more efficient to make, right? What they do is they change the shape and detail of the cyma recta and the cavetto there so that they are easier to produce. Okay, moldings begin to shrink in size. Okay, in the 1950s, you have a clamshell molding. Okay, clamshell base and a clamshell casing. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it looks like a clam, right? It kind of rolls over. There is very little definition here. There's nothing to reflect the eye versus a molding like this, where if it was painted white, it would have all kinds of different lines on it. This is almost anti-classical because it's so simple and clean. Okay, so every different era, because of the story and the narrative, the history, Georgian, King George, Palladio, and all those different things, Federal period, the Adamesque style, Victorian, because we can do it with all these machines in there, arts and crafts because they want it simple. Everything has a story, and therefore the moldings communicate that. So how do we know that this is a Victorian plinth block? Well, it came from a Victorian building on one we were restoring, but we also know that it came from books like this. This is an 1892 standard millwork catalog. Okay, in these catalogs they break out moldings and details of where they belong, but this book in the 1890s was one of the first books to have moldings in there, and it's called the New Universal Molding Catalog. Okay, where they actually have moldings laid out. New Universal Molding Catalog. And so there are 495 different moldings in here. These are panel molds, but they're very Victorian, right? They're very expressive. They have all these crazy shapes and details that go along with them. If we look at a book from the 1920s, it has a very different set of moldings. If you look at the back of their books, all of a sudden these moldings are flat and plain. They're no longer as expressive as ornamental. In this book, there's 20 pages of panel molds. In this book there's 5, because panel molds aren't nearly as important as they were back in that other era. So as these eras change, right, the moldings change. One of the books I'm going to offer you up is this the Hull Historical Molding Catalog. Basically, when I wrote my book Historic Millwork, which is about millwork in this period of time, in this post-industrial era between 1870 and 1940, I cataloged all those moldings and molding books that were available to talk about what was available in the catalogs from that period of time. Part of that exercise was actually cataloging moldings so that I know, and I've got in here on band moldings or casings or window stools, I've actually got when it was available in the catalogs, what style it is, and a little bit about it, so that you can actually look at these moldings and know when they came from. But the point is that there is an historical basis for moldings. There is a story, there's a narrative to each of these moldings. And now as we look at moldings that are available from lumber yards today, you'll see how silly and confusing they are, and why we need to go back to sensible moldings if you want to build beautiful things. Let me just start with one of the silliest moldings, right? This is called an embossed molding. Now, if you look at here, embossed moldings were invented during this Victorian era, okay? How come? Well, how do I know that? Well, there's catalogs where it shows embossed moldings, but there's also, that's when this was invented. This is an industrial type process where they take a hot iron and they roll it across the wood and press and burn into the wood these shapes. Now, these are classical shapes that they burned into them, but they're silly because they're a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox of a copy of a copy of a copy. And you know that if you copy things over and over again, eventually you can't even tell what it is. And that's what this is. Now look, here's an egg and dart molding, right? Here's a hand-carved egg and dart molding. And when you compare the difference between these two, right, you can see the depth and shadow. I just spray painted this morning so you could see a little bit better. And as I did it, I started to lose the definition in these moldings because the paint was, I spray painted this. If you paint this, you're going to lose all that definition. This is a leaf and dart, and this is a hand-carved leaf and dart, right, with a bead and reel underneath. The difference is astounding. Now, to hand carve this is $250 a foot, right? To make this is, $1 a foot, right? So we'll talk about when to use these things, but this is a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox, okay? The problem is that because of industrialization, okay, we can get an egg and dart molding very inexpensively. But my contention is that this is such a piece of crap, okay, that you don't want it in your house. Realize that in the pre-industrial era, an egg and dart molding, okay, or a leaf and dart molding was very expensive to do, okay? And I criticize people that like go to Versailles, okay, and they come back from Versailles and they say, well, I'm going to build a house like Versailles. Don't, okay? Because that was an expression of a handmade era that was a display of wealth that was just can never be copied again, okay? And so when people try to rebuild Versailles, okay, or when people try to get an egg and dart molding in their house, they end up falling on their faces because everybody knows that that's a fake, okay? And so ornamentation and detail like this is Victorian, okay? And it was very rarely used in the Victorian era. So to put it into our houses or to put it into a trailer home, right, it doesn't make sense. And so again, bad molding. Another kind of molding I don't want you to pick up at the lumber yard is this one here, okay? Anything with a dental in it, ignore it, okay? Don't choose it, okay? Now, how come? The dental is probably one of those most misused, screwed up details in design today, okay? Now, what I showed you last time is that the dental always happens in the bed mold, okay? Always happens right here, okay? So if we look at our cornice, okay, if we look at our detail, the bed mold would be down here, okay, where you would split this detail and you would insert a bed mold. And the bed mold would, and the dental in that bed mold would have a proportional relationship. Remember, in the classical system, everything is proportional. So there will be a relationship, and remember, everything is related to D, the diameter of the column at the base, okay? So you see this system as it's broken out, and you see that there is actual a size and a spacing, right, that has a proportional relationship. Notice that there is a dental, and then the space in between the dental is very important, right? Here it's just random, it's put together, and the size of this molding versus the dental is wrong. So don't buy a molding like this thinking that you're going to improve the quality of the thing, because all this does is show that you're unsophisticated and you don't know how the parts and pieces go together. So the last part of my rant here on bad moldings is moldings like this, okay? Where you have a plastic insert that's put inside that shows a kind of a bound floral or leaf pattern, okay? Now, when was this made? Well, this is a new molding, but the technology for this was done during the Victorian period, where they would actually, again, industrialization, right? They were making things because the machine enabled them to do things, but they would put together. Now you can buy this molding for, you know, a few dollars a foot, right? It's not worth it, and here's why. I wrote a book with Christine Frank where we studied the historic rooms of Winterthur. Now, Winterthur is the DuPont family home, and what he did was he collected American rooms. And so he has a collection of rooms from pre-industrial, okay, so before 1860. We studied 40 rooms in there, Georgian and Federal rooms in this period. And very few of these rooms at Winterthur, very few of historic rooms had carving like this, okay? This would have been something that would have been extremely expensive, okay? So the percentage of rooms at Winterthur, of those 175 rooms, I think, you know, 5 or 10, right, have a lot of carving and ornamentation. It was very rare, okay? So be careful about putting ornamentation in your house, because it just screams either a Victorian, okay, or the fact that you can't afford the real thing, okay? And so if you have a, you know, $400,000 house you're putting trim into, don't put this in there. If you have a $4 million house you're putting trim into, be very selective about the kind of ornamentation you put in there. One of the other kind of concepts in the classical system is this idea called punctuation. Punctuation is that 1 to 5, 1 to 6, 1 to 7, or I think I've said that before, is that opening, there's a proportional relationship, and that the moldings on the outside of that opening punctuate or define that method. And it's very difficult when you have moldings like this to punctuate anything. The shadow lines, you can't get it because, you know, this is, you know, 5/8 of an inch thick. realize that traditional, Georgian moldings were 3 inches, right? Compare a 3-inch molding to this, right? It doesn't work. So I can pick up every molding on this table and talk about kind of where it came from, what period it is, what its story is, and some of these communicate poorly, okay? Some of these just don't work. And there's habits and details that have happened to moldings over time that are confusing, right? This molding said it was a Georgian molding, right? Which is that earliest period over here, okay? It's not a Georgian, there's nothing Georgian about that molding, okay? It's closer to a federal molding, if anything, but this whole thing where this is cut out in the middle is much more Victorian. This is actually a collection of a bunch of different moldings. This cavetto, okay, I know people love the cavetto and it looks really good up to the thing, but there really isn't a strong historic precedent for this large crown up there going into a ceiling, because it just doesn't show up into the catalogs until the 1920s and 1930s. And so there isn't a traditional, okay, there isn't a Georgian federal pre-industrial era detail of this, right? They wouldn't have made this by hand. One of the other things, crowns have gotten really big, okay? And remember, the whole system here of this classical system is that there's a proportionality, right? That all the parts and pieces relate. Look how big this crown is. It's like 5 inches wide. If we look at our system, okay, and if we look at how these historic cornices are put together, realize that this cornice here came from a room with 12-foot ceilings. I mean, to proportion out a molding of this size, you'd have to have rooms that are 20-foot ceilings, right? I don't think there's many of those around, okay? Furthermore, the depth and proportion of this thing means that shape right there, okay, and the way that light reflects off that shape is dull, okay? It does not communicate well because it's very hard to read. One of the things you notice that moldings post 1940, okay, so after we got into that ranch era, is that moldings begin to shrink and fall. And so one of the things that's inherent about historic moldings is almost all pre-1940 moldings are at least 3/4 of an inch thick. These casings and these details, right, here's a pretty standard one, maybe 5/8 of a half an inch, right? That moldings just get smaller and smaller. And look, it's really hard to read those details. And historic moldings all have these sharp and crisp details that allow you to read them. Again, we're trying to read moldings. So, let me sum up. So how do you pick a good molding today, right? Well, I've designed moldings for a couple of companies that I have a ton of respect for. Windsor Mill out in California and Kukin Lumber in New Jersey. These are some of the moldings that we've designed for them, all based on an historical precedent. This is a federal base molding that we designed for Windsor. Notice the size of this molding versus that, right? I mean, really? Are you kidding, right? It's 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches thick. It stands up. There's clear lines that you can define things. Look at this Georgian and these federal moldings. Look at the size of these things, right? This is what and how original houses and historic houses are put together. So there are still good moldings out there. Our company, of course, we make all our own moldings and mill them ourselves, and so for our custom projects. But there are good moldings out there. There are good ways to find them. Windsor sold all across the country. Kukin, you can contact both of those companies. Those guys get it. They understand the classical and the historical nature. They understand that there's good versus bad moldings, and they get it. So that's one different way of finding good moldings. Look, guys, sorry to rant on you, but there really is a difference between a good molding and a bad molding. There really is a way of determining that and figuring that out. I've mentioned a number of resources today. Some of them are from the books I've written, and you can actually order them. If you go to info@brenthull.com and email me, I can send you this packet of books, or you can just get one of them or whatever you want. We'd love to know that you're trying to research and figure this stuff out yourself. I think it's really important. We'll do this Traditional American Rooms book. I've got a paperback as well as a hardcover. If you want the hardcover, it's $30. If you want the paperback, it's $20. I'll sign it if you want me to sign it. The molding catalog's $10. And then this book, very expensive, from the publisher Wiley. I think we have to pay $50 for them, so I just get it to you for $50. So if you're interested in those books or want to understand that, info@brenthall.com, and you can order those and we'll send you them. I do want to thank my sponsors, Windsor and Kukin. Those guys get it. Those guys get historic moldings. Please go to their websites. Please look them up and patron them, because those are good moldings that you can work with. They all have an historical precedent, and you can build good things with those catalogs. Follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Hull Millwork, Hull Homes. I really appreciate you putting up with my rants. Thanks for watching.